I think we all go into architecture as very optimistic people, and we're trying to make the world a better place. And I really liked doing architecture, but I started to realize that you could have a bigger impact on the supply chain. The materials that we were using in our buildings actually had a much bigger impact than the buildings themselves because they were touching people who couldn't afford architects. They were touching everyone. They're touching our whole system.
You're listening to Piper, the podcast where we decode healthy and regenerative design. I'm Beth Cochran. Like many of today's architects and designers, Lona Rerick wasn't taught material health in school. She had some exposure to sustainable design in college at the University of Oregon, which seeded her interest, but it wasn't until a lecture she attended as a young practicing architect that she was exposed to the idea of materials as nutrients. The talk was presented by none other than Bill McDonough, one of the pioneers behind Cradle Design, and it set Lona on an exciting new path. Now, nearly any exploration into material health will eventually lead you back to Lona. She helped lead the creation of the AIA Materials Pledge, is the co-chair of the mindfulMATERIALS board, a member of the Living Future Material Health Technical Advisory Group, and a founding co-leader of the Portland Materials Transparency Collaborative. She was also part of the group that created the standardized format for the Health Product Declaration. And today, Lona serves as an architect and the director of regenerative design materials at Perkins&Will, where she leads the firm's efforts to specify materials that meet the 5 impact areas: human health, climate health, ecosystem health, social health and equity, and circular economy.
I went to Oregon at a time when sustainable design wasn't routinely taught in architecture school, but there were, a bunch of old hippies there, and we were learning about passive design. We weren't learning about, the materials stuff at all. That was like pretty much before that. But I got a pretty deep knowledge of, how to approach sustainable design. So I had that seed planted by where I went to college. When I was a young architect in Portland, I went to a lecture that Bill McDonough gave about healthier materials, and I was just stunned. I remember just being stunned that these products commonly contained hazardous materials, and it was perfectly legal. It blew my mind, and I think in this work, just again and again, you can't unknow what you learn. And then as an architect, I think we all go into architecture as very optimistic people, and we're trying to make the world a better place. And I really liked doing architecture. I like taking the fat pen drawings and making them into buildings that worked. But I started to realize that you could have a bigger impact on the supply chain. The materials that we were using in our buildings actually had a much bigger impact than the buildings themselves because they were touching people who couldn't afford architects. They were touching everyone. They're touching our whole system.
That was really early on in this healthier materials movement. How was it in those early days for you? Was it a lot of hard work to try to find healthy materials and advocate for them?
Yeah, we were really kind of bumbling along at that time. I remember there were a few resources. There was Environmental Building News that became Building Green. There was Healthy Building Network had reports out there. There were some people that I'm standing on the shoulders of, like Robin Gunther, that were really doing the work to understand where we could make better choices. Because that's a lot of the trick, is you can't just change it all at once. You have to understand where there are inflection points and where you can make choices. So those early days, I was literally sending super naive emails to manufacturers saying, I hear these ingredients are bad. Can you tell me if they're in your materials? And most of them were just perplexed by the ask, because we had, as a profession, not been asking them those questions. We kind of just accepted whatever materials they gave us and figured out how to use them in our buildings and designs.
When you would send those emails, what kind of response were you getting?
A lot of times, no response. Sometimes, I'd follow up with phone calls, and the manufacturers didn't know. And I think that's a lot of the realization I've had in this work, is I've come from this place of being naive and somewhat idealistic, where send these missives out into the world and say, you have to give me perfection. And then starting to realize that they're dealing with their whole set of realities as well. They're dealing with suppliers to them and a whole supply chain that you have to go down to really understand what might be in your product, unless it's something super simple like solid wood. There's a lot of other players in that sphere, and sometimes the building and construction products aren't the biggest buyers of whatever's being supplied either. So there's it's very complicated once you get into it. So I think a lot of that early work made me realize the power of empathy, but also standardization. It was after that we created the health product declarations, and can we start asking for things in the same way over and over again, instead of all of us sending different forms of naive emails asking for different things in different forms. And we're still struggling with that as we start to tackle new issues. But I think that lesson really helps me inform others as they're tackling new issues within this space.
How did you get involved with developing the HPDs?
I was part of Building Green Sustainable Design Leaders Network, and we got a blanket invite for anyone within that network to join this meeting that was in Seattle that people that had been working on the idea of health product declarations had set up. And it was adjacent to a sustainable design leaders retreat. So they just said, oh, you guys can come early and come be part of this if you want. And I'm just I'm not missing this opportunity. But at the time, I'm just I felt like I was in a room full of giants. I remember Robin Gunther and Tom Lent and others were in that room. I'm so glad I was in that room, but I was pretty nascent in the work at the time.
And so did you guys just develop what would go into the HPDs?
One thing that struck me, the big decision that we made was that the HPD should be a standard, not a certification, that it should be a way for manufacturers to start disclosing the ingredients and the materials. But at least in the beginning, it's not a judgment. It's just a way of telling us about the ingredients in your materials, and that you could come in at any level. If you look at HPDs, I think there's still an SDS, safety data sheet level, which is not a high level of disclosure. And most of us are heading towards wanting 100 parts per million at this point. But that was a really important part of how the HPDs were set up, was that anybody could have an entry into this world of disclosing material ingredients.
What was that experience like in the early days compared to today?
It's interesting today, there is so much more information available, but it's there's information available in certain places that have momentum, and it's because of that early work we did. So in human health, the healthier materials, there's quite a bit of material ingredients disclosure available. There are places where you can definitely, with confidence say, I can specify a safer material for carpets or resilient flooring, or you could just avoid those materials altogether. It might be even better. But there are other places where we're just getting started. So I think it's both it's easier and it's more complicated. And half my job is to help people understand where it's easy and let them get started there, and work on the places where it's hard and try to pave the way for those other places to become easier as well.
Where would you say are some of those harder to navigate areas?
The other place that has a lot of momentum right now is embodied carbon, but that's only recently become easier because some people did some hard work there. Social health and equity is a huge one, and we have Grace Farms with Design for Freedom that's starting to look at forced labor and the supply chain. I remember a time when I was at ZGF, we were writing a blog post about social justice issues with building materials, and I used the word modern slavery, which Grace Farms uses all the time, and rightly so. And I got pushback from one of our marketing people, can you say slavery? I'm like, yes, you can, because it still exists. It still even exists in the United States with our penal system. And there's actually ties, between the penal system and production of some materials that are put into buildings, furniture, and some other things. So that's a big, hairy issue, hard to navigate. I was on a call yesterday with a group that's doing some really good work on timber supply chain issues and how do we start to understand where the wood that's going into our building products is coming from. Can we get, just with the solid wood products to start with, disclosure of the sources that went into the wood. It's kind of where health product declarations were in 2012. They were created, and like for the first few years, it was just like really hard to get anything. We're at that place with timber sourcing where like nobody was asking. Now we want to ask, how do we standardize that ask? How do we start getting that information? We're not going to start to layer on any judgment about that information until later, or at least most of us aren't. There's a few projects that are kind of out ahead that really dove deep on those topics and really started to understand how to source timber in a way that's supportive of the ecosystem.
It is mind-boggling though when you start to peel back the layers and see all the kind of opaque parts of that supply chain.
And that's, I'm dealing with this place where we're at where, a lot of people are FSC certification or nothing. And even within FSC certification, there's different levels of how good that ultimate timber source was. It's a really good shorthand, and we should all keep using it. But there's like nuances to timber production and sourcing that we're not quite understanding yet. And because we don't have all the information. My former colleague, Jake Dunn at ZGF, did a fantastic job in the Portland airport. And you probably talked to Evan at Sustainable Northwest Woods about that as well, because they were consultants on that project. And they really, dug down the supply chain because the Port of Portland wanted, the gorgeous, beautiful roof that ZGF had designed, but they didn't want, a clear cut as the story behind that wood. They really wanted to understand where the wood sourcing was coming from. And they also wanted the wood to be, pretty regional within a pretty close radius of the airport. There's not enough FSC wood in Oregon and or Washington to supply that project. So they really had to look at the forests themselves and understand, look, how can we get to sustainable sourcing without FSC? And a large part of that project is FSC, but there's a chunk that isn't because they just needed to get enough wood for the project. So there's a lot of wood from the Yakima tribal forests, and there's some wood from the Willamette Valley and some oak forests, and it's a really great story. And I think like that kind of nuanced understanding that you get when you work with a consultant like Sustainable Northwest Wood is where we could get to as an industry, is better understanding the impacts of the wood we're choosing.
I'm glad you brought that up. It is interesting too, thinking about, I think it's kind of easy to just go with a trusted source like FSC, but there's all these other producers that maybe haven't gone down that path of getting certified or can't afford it, maybe smaller producers. And I know that was part of the conversation too at Greenbuild for material producers that maybe can't afford some of these other types of certifications. When that is the case, how do you evaluate materials, especially if they don't have some of those certifications behind them?
If you hang out with me long enough, you'll know that I have like a food analogy for all of this work. And I keep thinking about like, we'll know that we really made it with the sustainable building materials movement if we get to the place where food has gotten. And I think that, food was about 10 years ahead of us and starting to ask for material ingredients. And that drove people to really think about like, I can't pronounce this. Should I be putting this in my body? I think we're going through the same kind of thing with building materials. And you get to a realization that the simpler, more natural materials are inherently better. A lot of what I'm struggling with now is like, okay, I'm a big believer in the transparency and certifications and really getting good information about building materials, but we've got to leave space for those small producers that are bringing us inherently better products. And so how do we do that? And I think about with the food movement, now you can go to your your local farmers market. There's been this huge boom of farmers markets since people really started to understand their food better. And you can go there and you can talk to the people that produce that food. You can go out and visit their farm if you want to. And I think if we get to this place where materials are more local and regional and not like done in some magic way far, far away, that will just get to better materials. So I haven't quite completely figured out how we leave space for that, but there are things we've done within Materials Pledge reporting and things that I'm working on internally where it's just like, okay, where are the exceptions where we, you know, understand that a product is inherently better, but they can't afford the certifications. Not totally sure, but working on making space for that. I think Habitable has done a great job with the informed product guidance, where you can look at a spectrum of product types and understand that something's inherently better. So that's something that we allowed for within Materials Pledge reporting. I'd like to see, within Perkins&Will as well, is to just say, okay, these, like, if it's solid wood with a safe finish, then, it's inherently safer than something more complicated, and maybe it doesn't need the disclosure.
Are clients approaching you with specifications already in mind as far as material health, or is it still something where you guys are presenting the concept?
Both. I mean, part of the reason I was really excited to join Perkins&Will's team is that there's already an amazing group of materials experts here, but also that we work with a lot of the leading clients. We're working with clients that have set standards for healthier, low carbon materials. So that gives us an opportunity with those clients that are kind of the leading edge to see how far we can take things. And then we can take those lessons learned and take them to all of our clients. So we have a program within Perkins&Will called the Switch List, and it's really looking at like where's that low hanging fruit? Where are the places where we can just say, no, these are our rules for how we specify these certain types of products. So it's a bit of both.
Can you describe that switch list?
Yeah, so the switch list is really mostly focused on healthier materials for right now, but it looks at, certain product types where there's enough momentum in the marketplace to say, yeah, we can set some real rules. We know that there are good alternatives for this. So, no vinyl flooring, no crumb rubber backing on carpets, no fly ash in carpet backing. So it's just, it's a pretty straightforward and short list for now, but it's something that we can build on as the market changes and evolves, and we can add more things to it.
So when you're building, or maybe you're guiding others on how to build a set of materials for a project, where do you recommend they start, or where do you start?
The one that I love to send people to that I already mentioned was Habitable's Informed Product Guidance. I just think they do such a nice job. It's like a stoplight guidance, and red stuff you should definitely avoid, and green stuff you should definitely use. But there's a lot of nuance in the middle. I think they just did such a great job of laying out where there are inherently better product types. So I love sending that. And I also think that resource is really layman friendly. You can just send it to somebody who is brand new to this work. You can send it to clients to help them understand. So that's a place that I'd love to start people. It is really wonderful within Perkins&Will that we have the switch list. So a lot of people are, know about that. And that's also a resource. And we have resources within the firm to help support using the switch list as well.
Anyone can access the switch list, and it provides a good primer for major product and material groups to avoid. It is primarily focused on healthier materials, but Lona said they're exploring when and how to possibly layer on other criteria, like embodied carbon, but to do so in a way that doesn't make it impossible to find materials that meet specifications. Given the different criteria that you could measure against or build your materials, could program around, because it is hard to find materials that meet all of those with human health, low carbon, social justice. How do you prioritize? Do you start with material health or human health?
Yeah, within Perkins&Will, that's really been our starting point. I do think there is a bit of carbon tunnel vision, that we take the numbers on EPDs a little too seriously. And I'm not saying that from a place of we shouldn't use them. It's absolutely a tool to help us understand. I just think going to like 2 decimal points gives way too much credence to how accurate those numbers are. So that's another caveat to being careful about how we layer things on. It's hard to prioritize, but for now, I think we and basically the industry at large is prioritizing those places where we have momentum. So human health and climate health, also known as embodied carbon, are the places that have the most traction in the industry. But doing a lot of work in the other parts of looking holistically at a building material. I had the pleasure in 2018 of leading the creation of the AIA Materials Pledge. And, of course, that has 5 impact categories. And I'm talking about the 2, human health and climate health, have the most momentum right now. But there are lots of us working on the other 3 impact categories: ecosystem health, social health and equity, and circular economy. And I think finding projects where you can pilot those other impact categories is a great way to start to build the case and build a little momentum and really understand what you can do now and what's a real stretch. So that's a way that we're using projects to really understand where we can go next.
Interesting. Just in thinking about circular economy, do you think by meeting that criteria, you almost inherently knock out several of the others?
Yeah, I think about this a lot because, the Materials Pledge has 5 impact categories and we're human. It's really hard to think about, 5 things meaningfully all at once. But when you start to look at them, there's just so many overlaps. And circular economy, like most of the impacts of those materials have already happened. If you're reusing a material, even if you're remanufacturing it, like that's still like 80% of the impacts probably. And there could be a social justice benefit to it. Could build a local economy. Now we need places to store materials. Now we need resources to help understand where the materials are and how much and how they could get from A to B. And it really drives a need for a very local regional economy. So I think there's something really interesting if we could dig into the circular economy. We're really digging into all the impacts at once.
It certainly presents an exciting opportunity and one that I think evokes a very deep creativity or a need for creativity.
Yeah, I was just on a call with a project team yesterday talking about we're doing a big tenant improvement for a client, and they are all in on, they have a climate commitment. They really want to hear about the embodied carbon story of the project. So it's encouraging the team to look for opportunities to reuse materials within the space. And the team, it was very engaged and it was really exciting. They're like, oh, we had a project with a tech client where we took a bunch of data cabling and made an art installation out of it. And I was talking about, a project when I was still at ZGF when we redid the Portland office, and they have a great fabrication shop and took a bunch of old workstations and made new things out of it, made model displays, made rolling storage out of it. Like they just when you get creative, then there can be some really fun things that come out of it. It's like it's all a design problem. And I think that when you make the design problems more challenging, and reusing materials can be challenging, then you may just end up with something more interesting than you would have had otherwise.
And certainly unique that no one else will likely have. When thinking about material health, what do you wish more designers understood about it, just beyond kind of checking the box of avoiding harmful chemicals?
I've been thinking about this a lot, having changed jobs recently and really trying to understand, like, how do you make change within a really big organization? Even a big organization that has a lot of the right pieces in place, there's people. And how do you help people make change? And I keep coming back to, it's like a heart-head problem. You have to let people find their emotional connection into why they care about the issue. Is it they have a child with asthma? I did. Is it like you know somebody that you love that works in a factory. My grandfather had asbestos in his lungs from the factory he worked in. So I think like people have to find their own way into it, and once you have their heart, then you have to make it easier for them to actually implement it, and so that becomes the head problem. But like you can't make it so everybody has to have the level of subject matter expertise that I do. How do you give them the tools to say, I care about this, now I'm doing it on my project, and you have the reward of actually following through on doing it on the project. So I think like the thing I'd love for more people to understand, and I'm working on here, is that it's easier than you think to get started, and that you don't have to do everything all at once on the first project that you're doing it on. So you can do a little bit on this project. Maybe you only do a couple product types and you really focus on human health. And the next project you focus on, more products, and you add in some embodied carbon stuff, and you start to understand how these things work together. Because as architects and designers, we work on project after project after project. You don't have to do it all the first time.
That makes it much more approachable. Otherwise, it seems like it could easily get overwhelming.
Yeah, we're at this place though. I mean, yes, it definitely could easily get overwhelming. And I think, just understanding that you're human and working within a construct of an industry, and the industry is at a certain place. But we are at this place where there's been enough work and enough momentum that it's way easier than it was 10 years ago. So there can be some easy wins to start with. And I think just like giving yourself the grace to understand that you don't have to solve everything.
Aside from Habitable, are there any other go-to tools that you use for beginning your materials planning or research?
Within Perkins&Will, we have a lot of our own tools, which makes it pretty great. And I'm very excited because we're doing a Design for Freedom pilot project. Hopefully, well, we applied, so hopefully we get it. So I think they have some great tools if you want to dive in the deep end on forced labor in the building product supply chain. There's all the major players in this work: Health Product Declaration Collaborative, Living Future with Declare labels. I spent a lot of time on the HPDC repository, EC3 from Building Transparency. When you're diving deep on carbon, is a great place to go. So yeah, I mean, those are some of my basic go-tos. I like to go to the source.
Do you still see greenwashing happening in this industry?
Yes. Unfortunately, yes. I mean, this is where I get a little bit worried about the carbon tunnel vision, because I've seen some particular product types, and I'm not going to name names right now, that seem to be like all in on like, look, we have an EPD, don't worry about the other stuff. And so that feels like greenwashing to me. It's kind of very sophisticated level of greenwashing, but yeah, I definitely still see it.
Are there some ways that designers can be more cognizant, or just maybe some red flags?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go to product's website and their sustainability page only has EPDs, it doesn't have HPDs and other types of disclosures, that to me is something to question. There's certain words like recyclable, that doesn't mean anything. I get a little worried about certain materials using petrochemical binders. Like I had someone send me a product, and it was like, oh, this is a natural product. And I'm like, but it looks like plastic. And the product actually had an HPD, so kudos to them for that. But when I dug into it, it's just like, yeah, it had rice husks in it, but it was basically vinyl. And so like, watch out for when they say that something is like all natural materials and it doesn't look like it. Like, trust your gut on that. A lot of times they'll use different words, like it's made, that particular product was saying it's made out of salt and rice husks. It's like the salt was like the vinyl chloride to make the vinyl. I mean, chlorine is salt, but it's not. Like, there's bigger impacts to it.
You do have to do your due diligence. What are you most optimistic about when it comes to the future of material health?
I am really excited that we're digging in on the other impact categories, that we're really starting to get back to like ecosystem health, and that we're, as an industry, making the connection to social justice. It feels like for a long time there were these environmental justice organizations, communities affected by manufacturing extraction, that are out there like fighting for their neighborhoods and their communities. And we weren't making the connection that the products we were choosing were affecting these places because they feel far away. So I'm excited that we're starting to dig in that. I think it starts to connect a lot of dots. I'm really excited about circularity. I think one of the inherent problems that is underlying all of this is the linear economy, this kind of take, make, waste system. And that if we have to start thinking about things in circularity, that we'll start to really think about what materials make sense. And like Frankenstein materials, like I like to call them, anything that's like composite, that's mixing like wood chips and plastic and other things like that can't be circular. That's like on its way to a landfill. It's just when. But if you start to think like, I want to be able to take this material apart and get the aluminum off this plastic so I can reuse it, then maybe I just don't want to glue it to the plastic in the first place. So I think as we start to think about things in a more thoughtful way about their bigger impacts, that is going to push us towards circularity and not thinking that everything can just always be new.
Considering the upstream and downstream impacts of a material certainly introduces more complexity, but it also opens the door for ingenuity and perhaps a fun design challenge. But one of the most important takeaways is that Lona wasn't afraid to dive into exploring new things, often before she felt quote unquote ready. She didn't enter the profession as a materials expert, but through research and saying yes to opportunities, she built up her expertise. A good reminder to just start. Start where you are and with what you have. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with a friend or colleague, or leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast player, but only if you liked it. Let's keep spreading the word about healthy and regenerative design. Lastly, if you have an idea for the show or want more content about this topic, visit piperrepublic.com. Thanks for listening.